Centrality in multiparticle production in ultrarelativistic nuclear collisions.
Thank you very much for the organizing committee for the possibility to make this talk at this conference. The talk is prepared by their rather young team, including Tatiana Dorozhova, Vladimir Kovalenko, and Andrei Svyakov from the Laboratory of Ultra-High Energy Physics, which organized here at the St. Petersburg State University. And this picture, the resolution is not quite high, but it's sort of symbolic because the task of this talk is rather difficult, the plenary discussion, because during the last years we have an ocean of data coming from the RIG collider and from Large Hadron Collider. And so to make an overview, in any case, in all attempts, we'll have sort of icebergs, and only tips of icebergs could be shown quite naturally. So I hope that you understand all the problems of the reporter. So what I would like to go through, so the report consists of two parts. First of all, some overview of what was done in the modern heavy ion experiment, and then the main topic of the report, the problems which are existing and which are viewed by the experimentalists of St. Petersburg, relevant to the object of study. So first of all, I would like to mention some historical remarks that the term relativistic nuclear physics comes from Russia, from Dubna. It was the Laboratory of High Energy and accelerator in Dubna in Heavy Ion Physics Laboratory, and academician Alexander Malkin, who was the head of the laboratory. In 1971, the first relativistic beams with neutrons were delivered in the Centrality at Dubna. And the very first attempt of studies of nuclear effects in the high energy interactions on nuclear studies. So this is a slide from one of the first reports prepared by Baldwin in '75. Then the accelerator in the United States, Bevelmark, SPS and CERN, then RIG, and finally Large Hadron Collider in 2009. The main idea of the relativistic physics was to concentrate the high energy, the highest possible energy, in the small volume of interacting nuclei. It was Collins and Perry in '75 who suggested that at the very high densities, the specific states of quarks and gluons would be obtained because the strong interaction constant will go to zero. So we'll have a sort of gas of ideal gas of quarks and gluons in conditions of the high density collisions. And these things would exist in the, for example, in the neutron stars. It was later Shulyak, working in Novosibirsk, who coined the phrase orbital plasma, and he studied the high temperature behavior of system at the high temperatures. What is shown here is a phase diagram of the colliding system. So we have two systems which goes and collide at some point. We have some spatial coordinate, and then we have some time coordinate. We'll go to this picture a bit later. So what we observe, we can expect here that at some moment the conditions will be in favor of creation of this specific state of matter-core covalent plasma. This slide, which is from the recent review of by Müller, is shown this phase diagram that we reached which is studied in the lattice QCD calculations, and the transition from the hadronic to quark-gluon plasma degrees of freedom could be observed at some critical temperature. So this picture shows some entropy as a function of temperature over force power of temperature. And this is relevant to the modern study panorama, which has been conducted by experimentalists using the colliders. So one can expect the boundary between the hadronic matter and quark-gluon plasma. And if you go with a low temperature regime into the compressed baryonic matter, one can get to some neutron stars region at the colors of the conductors. If you heat this thing, then you can expect to get very high temperatures and low baryonic content. What is crucial here is to find out what is the sort of transition Is it the first order or just crossover? And the critical idea is to use also for critical endpoint, which has been studied by NA69, NA49, now is conducted by NA69 at CERN, and by RIC in New Energy Scan experiment, the search of phase diagram in order to establish the existence of this critical point. What is important here is that with this phase diagram, the modern picture of relativistic nuclear collisions have following stages. We have the colliding nuclei, then at some point some pre-equilibrium, non-equilibrium state would be formed, which would lead to the formation of a quark-gluon plasma, which exists for some short period of time. Then we have a mixed phase, expansion and cooling of this, and finally the chemical freeze out, the kinetical freeze out, and finally we see the pictures which is really observed by experimentalists. So experimentalists are observing these pictures and they are trying to reconstruct their initial conditions. This movie on the right is just an illustration of one of the event generator, which is in line with the modern picture of hadronic collisions. These modern heavy ion experiments, including those in the LHC, they studied the collisions of proton and lead collisions with the naive assumptions that nothing interesting is in PP collisions. Some so-called cold nuclear matter effect would be studied with proton-lead collisions, and all quark-gluon plasma things and very exotics could be discovered with proton-lead collisions. As an example, I would like to show you very briefly, an example of various installation in LHC, which is a huge magnetic spectrometer, which is included in the magnetic yoke produced by Izhovsky Zavod here in St. Petersburg. Inside we have some tracking chambers, the central part. Then we have the forward muon spectrometer. We have time-of-flight system. We have electromagnetic calorimeters and hadronic calorimeters. We have also two detectors which are here to measure the centrality, to measure the nucleons, spectators coming from the interaction region. And in the very center there is a central tracking system which is designed to work to define vertices of tracks. And St. Petersburg State University was in this development since '92. So this is a picture of a real event registered in 2010 on collisions of two heavy nuclei, central collision, and one can see that this installation is really a fantastic machine when you can reconstruct every charged particle tracks coming from the interaction region. The dimension of this picture is roughly speaking like this territory. What is important that the modern experiments have very high capability of particle identification. So in a tracking system, time-of-flight system, time projection chamber, high momentum particle identification system, transition radiation detector, which allows to disintegrate electrons, ions, cions, protons, and one can see here of the nucleus of deuterium, antideuterium, helium, antihelium, and others. So, briefly on some experimental results. Here you can see the spectra of identified particles. So we have PT of the particles and the yields as a function of PT for pions, for charged pions, for charged kaons, for proton and antiprotons. And this is measured in lead-lead collisions. And these measurements are done at different centrality of collisions. Centrality will be the key word. I will go to it a bit later. So first of all, you see that the quality and the statistical errors are very small. So high quality data are obtained here. And one can see also in this picture that we can see there are three regions. the multiparticle production terms comes from the fact that the majority, 95% of all particles, are below 1.5 GeV/c momentum. So we have very high yields of particles. We are colliding 10 electron volts per nucleon in the system of mass, and we produce very soft particles, and they are dominating the spectra. Then we have the region of the very high PT, which is exponentially falling from several orders of magnitude, and some intermediate region. So there is also the discussion about soft physics and hard physics and interplay in the region, and it's also important to understand that soft part of the spectra are rather difficult to analyze in theoretical models, because perturbative calculations could be done only for the high momentum. So one of the first experimental results was the multiplicity. So multiplicity is a function of the center of mass energy. And what we see that it's a well-known proton-proton data. So we are measuring the yields of charged particles in the central gravity, so perpendicular to the colliding system. And we see that in case of lead-lead collisions, we have their law, which is different from the proton-proton case. And the growth from RIC energy to LHC energy is considerable. And this first simple observable brings, of course, some constraints to the model. The mean number of this charged particle multiplicity, and you see that we are producing about 1,500 particles in the mid-rapidity, in the central lead collisions. Why it is important? Why multiplicity is important? Because it's the first indication on chaosity that we just talked in the previous report. It's a possibility to check the energy density formed in the collision. Because if you know the number of particles and their energy, and if you know the volume of the formed in the interaction region, then you can estimate the energy density. And this is the goal of this Large Hadron Collider. So these measurements are important to constrain other models, and you see the number of theoreticians working in this region and their predictions, and some models were there, and it's a separate story about what the models are reasonable. What is important in the collisions of in these studies is the discovery of the elliptic flow. If you have the collisions of two nuclei, non-central collision, then you have sort of overlap region, which is sort of shaped like a baseball, and anisotropy, obvious anisotropy, which could be defined by experimentalists, was found to be transferred into the anisotropy in momentum space. And this was a very strong indication on some collectivity phenomena happening in the collision. Because if there was no interaction, no collectivity, one shouldn't expect any anisotropy in the azimuthal space. So this was one of the major discoveries at RIC. And more general, this elliptic flow is the second component in the, if you take the harmonics in the azimuth, the second Fourier coefficient is relevant to the elliptic flow. But what was discovered recently is the higher order harmonics. And this behavior of this higher order harmonics is very also intriguing and puzzling. For example, for the central collisions, you can see that the growth of the third harmonic, these green points here are indicated. Another interesting effect which was found is if you compare the spectra of ET in the case of peripheral collisions and in case of central collisions, and if you divide one spectra to another, but with the count of some factor of number of nuclear-nuclear collisions, because practically these are nuclear-nuclear collisions and these are nucleus collisions, for example. One can see the so-called nuclear modification factor. It was also involved, suggested rather long ago to use this. And what one can see with this nuclear modification factor is that we see a strong damping of the high PT particles. So this was interpreted like a creation of the very dense matter that stops practically the fast-moving particles, and that's why we see such behavior, such dramatic behavior. And one of the conclusions from the LHC is that if you compare the stopping or modification in case of Richter experiment at 200 GeV black points and red points for measured in the LHC, you see that the medium formed in the central red collisions appeared to be denser than at Richter. Another interesting thing was the discovery that studies of the dimension of the particle emitting source using the methods which were used, interferometry, which had been applied in astrophysics, Henry Brown twist method. So what was discovered is that the volume at LHC is about 1,800, about 1,000 cubic Fermis, and the lifetime, which is relevant to the length of this particle emitting source, is about 10 Fermi over C. So we are creating something in the large volume, rather dense, which has rather considerable lifetime. So a brief summary of what was said here, that we really entered an explored territory. And the medium produced, one can call it whatever, as you like, but the medium which is produced here has very interesting features. It has a rather large energy, we have rather large energy concentration, we have rather large volume, rather large lifetime, and what is important that this hydrodynamic approach in analysis of the azimuthal things brings to suggestion that we are dealing with almost ideal liquid. So some puzzles, first of all, the difference between Rick energy and 2.76 TeV energy in terms of distribution of charged particle versus centrality versus number of participating nucleons is practically the same, also the scale is different. So we do not see any dramatic difference in the scaling we are changing the position, impact parameter of nucleus. So we are scaling in geometry of collision, and we see practically the same pictures. It's rather puzzling. Another quite recent discovery concerning the third harmonic. So if you have nucleus collision, you can expect that some collisions, nucleons will be sort of triangular shaped. So you have some initial space anisotropy. But of course, okay, you can measure this harmonic, and if you take a look at lead collisions, you see that with the number of charged particles, you see some behavior of this harmonic. But the question is, if you take only one proton colliding with nucleus, how come that you can expect again the same behavior of the third harmonic in proton-lead collisions? This is not the end of the, it's just I'm briefly showing you some puzzles. Another well-known, and you heard about the Rich phenomenon, which was discovered first in lead collisions, in two-particle correlation functions. So you have the topology in azimuth and in rapidity. And you have short-range correlation peak, and you have these are indicative of two elliptic flow behavior, and some very lengthy structure, length in rapidity. In proton collision it was discovered, and in proton-lead collisions also it was discovered, and it's also one of the unexplained phenomena. Two slides about theoretical descriptions. Initially, it was assumed, a number of phenomenological models appeared. It was assumed that we have basically, to my mind, there are two pictures. Either we have the multiple pattern interactions of two colliding nuclei, and this is called quark-gluon plasma. Or we have strings stretched between the quarks and some color flux tubes which are stretched between the outgoing quarks and partons, and these strings are breaking due to their quark-anti-quark pair creation in the string. The very nice overview of the theoretical works and analysis are presented in some works by Müller, Schuliak, and also in quark matter conference. Briefly, it's a new form of matter with unique properties. What are the properties? It's a strongly coupled relativistic thing. It's liquid that cools into gas. It's nearly perfect with viscosity close to zero. It's thermalized rather fast, and it creates its new own vacuum state to exist. I have no time, of course, to go further. I would like to go to some problems which we see that should be discussed and presented, and that was studied by our team. So in centrality of collisions, this is a picture of those two interacting nuclei, and this is the interaction region, and of course we are interested in the density of this thing. One can understand from the nuclear physics experience that, of course, this static picture is not quite true, so we'll have lots of fluctuations inside. And these fluctuations, and one of the models are calculated the density fluctuations, and they're quite obviously they should be there. What is important? Terminology that has been used. So we have a part parameter, we have two pancakes, we call their relativistic compressions to one Fermi. This is sort of a schematic which shows that we have a part of the fragmented nucleus which comes in one direction. This part, non-interactive nucleus, spectators, comes in the other direction. So if we measure the energy of these nuclear spectators, we can count what was the number of nuclear participants, they are in this interaction region. And the multiplicity of charged particles coming from this region is denoted by as n charge. In all these things, it's very important we cannot measure directly the impact parameter. Theoreticians can do it very nicely. In experiment, what we can do, nature provides us with a distribution of impact parameter from 0 to infinity. But we can select events, we can pick up the events looking either on these spectators, measuring some characteristics, or by measuring some characteristics of particles coming from this region. So that's what we have. And what is important? Why centrality is important? Because first of all, it's a geometrical thing that produces the information for the future analysis of global observables, quite natural. Besides, some physics information can come from the fluctuation in the particles emitted from this region. So both are important for this physics, and we have to minimize some trivial effects, and some trivial effects will be if we'll select the events with impact parameter B, and if this parameter B in our selection is not constant, but within some intervals, then it means that we are mixing in the information a different number of nucleons which are participating. It's very trivial, very simple. But what to do, how to measure this, and this is one of the problems. So centrality could be defined as a fraction of cross sections from 0 to B impact parameter relevant to the overall impact parameter distribution. In experiment, one can make some thresholds in one or another type of the detector and measure a similar ratio and define the centrality. So this is the example. We have you have the impact parameter for two lead-lead nuclei, and you have the events distribution. It's quite natural that if you see something like disk colliding, you immediately obtain this linear plot. And the diffuse shape of nuclei produces this thing, and nothing happens after some 20 Fermi radius. Then you can cut this on slices and say that we are interested in the 0 up to 3 Fermi very central collisions, for example, and so on and so forth. Or you could measure the multiplicity coming from the central part, and also have the events distribution and multiplicity, and this is 100%, and then you count it in slices, and then say that I think that these are 5% of very central events. So this is the approach. With these measurements, you can define the participating region and the energy which comes there inside. So in experiment, it's been done by the so-called zero-degree calorimeter shown in the Alice experiment. So this 0 degree calorimeter is has a spaghetti of quartz fibers, and it measures the energy of neutrons, and another similar calorimeter, an energy of protons coming from this fragmentation of things going very fast in the forward direction after the breaking, after the interaction. And there are also two disks of scintillator which are called V0 multiplicity detectors. They can measure the flow of charged particles coming in this region, which is also brings some information on the centrality. So that's how the centrality estimated on multiplicity works. I already told you that we can measure the distribution. Then people are applying the so-called two-component model, so what is called Glauber field. The Glauber model assumes that you have the independent nuclear-nuclear collisions. Immediately, if you take nuclear-nuclear collisions and mean multiplicity of charged particle produced, and multiply by all possible nuclear-nuclear collisions, you'll get enormous number, which is absolutely not in hand with the real data. So it was Harzeyev who suggested to use the two-component model so that you have participant collisions and you have some parameter which dumps slowly the multiplicity, and then we are lucky that nature brought us with Saxon distribution for nucleons and the multiplicity distribution with square root s, because finally with this Glauber fit we are fitting the multiplicity, and then we are saying that in Glauber model we see these independent nuclear-nuclear collisions which are used widely by all communities in high energy physics to define the number of nuclear-nuclear interactions in the picture where the nucleus is composed of nucleons. You see what I mean? So what happens if you compare the amplitude of this V0 multiplicity detector with the 0 degree calorimeter, which measures the nucleons spectators? You see that anti-correlation. It's obvious that the more you have in the forward region, it means that you have. It means that. That in the forward region you are measuring those nucleons which were not interacting, and if there are a small number of non-interacted nucleons, it means that you have a central collision. So you have zero energy in ZDC, and you have maximum in V0. So this anti-correlation is quite well understood and quite well known. This region is just relevant to the experimental problems of measuring of a very small number of nucleons in case of very large number of nucleons in case of peripheral collisions, when you have complete nucleus coming practically non-interacting. But this picture shows that there is some correspondence between these two methods. And what is also important, we made several calculations using several Monte Carlo approaches. So in the standard Monte Carlo global model, we can have the Saxon distribution of nuclear density. We can nucleons frozen in this before the collision. So these are general things which I applied for heavy nuclei. And we applied the idea that we have the Poissonian distribution of particles from the particle-emitting sources. We assume that each nuclear collision produce some strings and etc. So finally, this is one of the approaches which shows that you have again similar picture of impact parameter distribution of events, and in case if you are interested in very narrow this grid, for example, a slice in impact parameter, and in this Monte Carlo model we show that immediately the distribution in number of participants is rather wide, because you are using the multiplicity and the fluctuations and the intrinsic processes which are there, they are damping the initial information of impact parameter. The same goes if you take the multiplicity and the number of participants. Again, you can measure the distribution, you can make the slides, and again you see that you have the rather wide distribution in number of participants using in this model calculation. If you scan over the centrality classes and the width of centrality interval, then you have can get this picture which shows that, for example, for very central, you define the centrality as very central. You have some bias if you use the very wide region of selection. That's the first thing. What is more important that the RMS of this participant, the width of participant distribution, is also could be very wide if you have the wide distribution, or you can decrease it by narrowing the interval used from the multiplicity. So the combined efforts of 0 degree colorimeter and multiplicity can bring you to some reasonable value, which is still sort of trivial fluctuations which are intrinsically present and you cannot get rid of this. So one has to know this if you wish to extract from the multiplicity or from other fluctuation things some information on physics. This is illustrated in much more striking before proton-clad collisions. So again, we have some distributions of particles in zero. Here we noted again a very narrow class. We can define, for example, 5 to 6%. And we see immediately that in a participant we have distribution practically covering all the region. So you cannot say anything in proton-clad collisions. What was the centrality? So imagine the pancake here, here, or directly here. It doesn't matter. What matters is the thickness, but not the parameter. So this was very brief conclusions from this. The multiplicity selection should not be used because the results could be ambiguous. Just to make a conclusion, I'm not going to spend more here. So this was checked also with another case. Measurements in, as I told you, there is a proton-clad collisions were considered as studies of cold effect. And what was measured? These are again the charged particle yields per participant as a function of square root s, and the results show that we have some growth in case of band collisions. In case of proton-proton collisions and proton-antiproton collisions, we have these black points, and the measurements done by Rick and Ellis, they show that the point in case of proton normalized lies somewhere here. One cannot explain why proton-clad collisions should lie below the proton-proton. So we applied two models. One of this is modified Lagrange model. The next one is shows the quality of the description of the multiplicity yields. And another one is non-Lagrange model developed by Vladimir Kovalenko, which also used the Bartonic picture of nuclear interactions. And parameters of the model were constrained on proton-proton data. The characteristic feature of all these models, and also, so these are again the description which is obtained by the model with fusion. The characteristic feature, as well as the standard event generator hijack, is that we are getting the proper description of multiplicity. So the model is tuned to produce the overall description of multiplicity. What is the result? The result is in this table. The number of nuclear collisions in the standard Lagrange model in proton-clad case is about 8. All these models which take into account the correct description of multiplicity bring it to almost twice smaller numbers. So this is and this goes immediately to some conclusions that this point, which is considered to be here, should be in fact here, and all these points should come here on this back place, which is quite different interpretation also in terms of physics. And if you go to the RAA, again, this number of collisions should be not to produce this blue curve, but in a smaller number or mean number of collisions, you are getting something like this. So all the results, in principle, should be reconsidered. So this is the end of my talk. The brief summary, the initial conditions of nucleus and proton-nucleus condition are very important, and that we are trying to analyze them in order to find the simple initial information on how to make the further analysis. The second point is that impact parameter P and relevant values and of number of participants, which are used both in soft and hard process. In fact, it should be treated differently for for soft and hard processes, because as we see, we can have some bias in case if we just apply the model which is not, which should not be applied in soft part. And all the results of the last slides, where we use modified Glauber, hygiene, and non-Glauber approach calculations, we show that we are getting the striking results for proton net collisions. So binary collisions should be treated differently for soft and hard processes in order to exclude any possible additional bias. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Question, please. May I ask a stupid question concerning whether the quark plasma exists or not? What can you say at present?
What can I say? That we can say any words, but what are the facts? The facts are, I show you the facts, which are not explained. It's a matter of theoreticians to bring the explanation. The current theoretical picture is that what is found is an ideal liquid, strongly interacting ideal liquid. You can call it quark-gluon plasma or whatever, but this is what is presently concerned as a main physical picture. So, I don't know if you're happy with this answer, I don't know. Because quark-gluon plasma in the initial state of ideal gas is non-existent, because it's not ideal gas. Ideal gas and ideal liquid, you see, it is different, absolutely different substances. It's interesting. I remind you the first slide with the iceberg. We don't know what is there. It's very interesting because we don't know. I don't know, for example.
But actually, we can have a liquid, not of quarks and gluons, but of particles, as you call them.
Particles are coming at a later stage. They come in at a later stage. They, after hadronization, yes, you really have particles, and okay, but the intermediate state, this is where we have this liquid. Because just particles, at the presently adopted theoretical picture, particles appear on the later stage of chemical result.
Okay, thank you. I think
we can continue.
Yes.
I think concerning this question, I think the question was, the way I understand it, is that at the very beginning of this research, there were groups doing calculation assuming there are only neutrons and protons. And I don't know if this disappeared or what are the contradictions to data that made them disappear.
The contradictions are quite obvious. It's lattice calculations and entropy. There are very huge entropy which arise because you got initially you have neutrons and protons, and then suddenly you have terrible amount of quarks and gluons. So that's the basic, which is supposed to highlight the experimental state of this QCD critical point. Because if it is discovered, it's one thing. If it's not discovered, then some theories are killed and complete consideration of whether it should come in this QCD picture of hadronic collisions.
all right. I think we'll thank the audience more. The next and the last talk of this session will be by Professor Advansky.